Welcome everyone once again to our cloud-related magazine of Cloud and Clear. And today we have with us Mr. Daniel Power. Hello, Dan. How are you?
Very well. Pleasure to be here, sir.
European Sales Manager for OneLogin. And we'll be speaking about the history of password authentication and single sign-on. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hi, Dan. How are you?
Very well indeed. Thank you. Very well indeed. Looking forward to Christmas.
So tell us a bit about yourself and about OneLogin so we'll know who we're talking to.
Hi. Yeah, my name's Dan Power. I've been working in IT for probably 30 years, 20 years as that has been involved in security, primarily end user security. And back in 2012, joined OneLogin. Really when cloud services began to emerge as a sort of popular way of delivering software. I mean, OneLogin as an organization was formed by two brothers, Thomas and Christian Pedersen. They had started working in Denmark for a company called Zendesk, which was one of the early providers of service management software delivered from the cloud. And it became quite obvious quite quickly to the two brothers that cloud was going to be successful. But the problem with cloud would be that people would have to have lots of different passwords to access each service. And so that sort of thought, that germ of a thought came to them that perhaps a single sign-on solution for cloud services would be a good idea. So they built a prototype, went across to San Francisco, got some money, and dare I say it, the rest is history.
It certainly is. Today we're going to talk about passwords. So let's start off by give us some background about passwords, so we get the show on the road, so to speak.
Yeah, no problem at all, Lee. I mean, passwords are almost as old as time itself. You know, everybody has had to find a way to effectively authenticate the fact that a person is who they are. So even way back when in Roman times, people who were patrolling the battlements would actually have a tablet and there would be a password, and only on delivery of both of those would somebody be able to actually access the town or the garrison that was being protected. Move on a few thousand years, and even in World War II, the Airborne 101 Division, they had a series of clicks and series of words that they would use to be able to find out whether that person who was the other side of the hedge was actually friend or foe. And those would change on a regular basis to ensure that they couldn't be compromised. So that's sort of really the back end history.
Right. So talk us through a little bit. Problems, evolution.
But I guess you can sort of divide the world up into that sort of traditional client-server based architecture, but where the really big change happened was when people changed from accessing everything through a sort of a traditional 32-bit app that and I think everybody's used Excel on a computer, or they've used, Word, or they've used an application that they've had to load from their computer. The world changed significantly when people began to deliver those services through a browser.
Right.
And the browser was great because it was fairly ubiquitous. And you didn't actually have to install the software on every single computer. All the person needed was a link, and to begin with, that link may be to a web server on the corporate network. But as it's developed over time, that browser has now become the sort of the front end to everything that we're doing, and that service that you can be accessing may be on your corporate network, but it could be just about blooming anywhere, to be honest. You just need that www.xyz.com and you're onto that service.
Right. So enter SAML.
Yeah, and it was really around that time that SAML began to take off. There was an understanding that SAML, or Security Assertion Markup Language, was needed to deliver a standard by which organizations like ourselves or Microsoft or Okta, whoever it might be, could actually deliver a single sign-on experience. Now, so the idea behind SAML, and we're getting a little bit technical here, is that you really wanted to remove the need to actually have a username and a password to access every application. So effectively, SAML allowed you to set up a trust between an application. So you may have Google or Mail, or you may have Office 365 or Salesforce, and what they call an identity provider. And that would be something like ourselves. And so all you actually had to do was log in once into us, and a trust had been built up between our product and these other third-party products. So once it's been configured, you didn't have to sign in again using username and password. And that's been a very powerful tool to deliver single sign-on whilst really protecting the customers and the data that resides behind these applications.
So nowadays, me personally, I'm facing a multitude of applications using via my browser, all kinds of software as a service applications, and so I keep a multitude of passwords. What do you expect?
And where are you keeping them, Lee? And this is the challenge, I think, that
It's a good
lots
question.
of companies have. It's I mean, there's sort of a bunch of stats that we can throw out here that can get quite scary, but the scary thing really is that they're real. So
well, don't skip on these. These are the interesting things. What kind of stats are we talking about?
So if you look at, I mean, we work with some people in the CASB market, people like SkyHigh and Netscope, and they do regular analysis of the usage of cloud applications. And they do analysis of log files, and they're seeing, an average sort of enterprise type organization actually using up to 2,000 applications on a monthly basis, and the average user actually having to have the username and password for up to 40 individual services to get their job done on a day-to-day basis.
Right. Sounds about right.
And the question is, as you were saying earlier, is where do we keep these? Because we can't keep them in our head unless you're absolutely brilliant. So what actually happens is those emails, they write them down, they're in spreadsheets, they're on post-it notes and things like that. And this is the real challenge for the enterprise out there today, which is how do I actually secure my company, but also just make the life of my end users better.
So what kind of developments are we seeing right now?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of, at a technical level, there's sort of two specific areas that I'd like to talk about. So the first one is SCIM. Now, SCIM stands for System Cross-Domain Identity Management. Bit of a mouthful. But it's not really so much about single sign-on. It's about creating the users in downstream applications in an automated fashion. And it's only really by automating that you can secure it. So you need to be able to say, when John joins company X, I can automatically create that user in Office 365, into Dropbox, and with the right rights. So we're beginning to see that sort of user management piece beginning to sort of overlap with authentication. So the second area that we're seeing is the evolution of the actual authentication or authorization protocols. SAML was really written to be very much a browser-centric system, and it's bulletproof, it's very solid. But it's actually not as easy as everybody would like to implement. So what we're now seeing is that developers who are now moving perhaps away from a browser-first strategy to being a mobile app-first strategy, looking at using things like OAuth and OpenID Connect. If you think of SAML as being more of an authentication protocol, things like OAuth and OpenID Connect are more of an authorization protocol. So you're actually authorizing somebody to do something within a destination application rather than authenticating the user directly into that application. I mean, that's a very high level, but fundamentally for users, it's just easier for the developers to do, which is the really important thing because we want people to use these standards. And it kind of comes into the world of social authentication, so people using Facebook and Twitter and so forth. So just looking for, again, security and user experience.
So we talked about password strength and cycling your passwords. What other challenges do enterprises face nowadays when it comes to password authentication on an organizational level?
So I think if you sort of take a step back, people have pretty much got a hold of that whole old-fashioned directory. So, people have spent millions of dollars making sure that they have that directory, it's sitting there, and they've got pretty good processes. But the challenge, as we were saying a minute ago, is how do I take that sort of traditional, well-learned enterprise best practice and apply that into the world of the cloud? And it's hard to do without doing a single sign-on service. And we're seeing more and more organizations, whereas traditionally they may have been saying, we're the IT team, we're only going to be responsible for emails, CRM, accounts, and maybe, a file sharing app. Actually now having to people coming and saying, well, we've got the HR apps out here, we've got the holiday booking, we've got the, if you're a techie, you've got AWS, you've got GitHub, you've got New Relic, and da. So you've got this massive number of applications, and you just really need to find a way to impose that standard down on top of all these services to protect the company, really.
What about smaller businesses?
With SaaS, all you need is a username and a password. So you can be a young 10-man company and you can be using exactly the same tools as your competitors into 10,000 user companies.
What would you say? Well, you talked about the importance of password strength and cycling, etc. But basically, with single sign-on, I have a single password. So if someone grabs that, I'm kind of risking everything altogether. Isn't that true?
That is so true. That is so true. And I think, we've seen some, again, sort of pretty scary stories with with various sort of repositories of billions of usernames and passwords available on the dark web and so forth. So the password is now the weakest point.
How do we mitigate that single point of failure?
And I think there are two real ways that people are beginning to do this. First is, and we would certainly recommend in an enterprise type world, is put multi-factor authentication in the front end.
Right.
There is a risk that somebody is going to have your password, especially if one recycles that password. And I confess I've done it once or twice, and it's just impossible to remember that many number of passwords. So putting two-factor authentication in the front, so the risk of somebody actually having your password and having your phone is pretty blooming low. So you really are reducing things on that front. I think in terms of sort of technical developments, what we're also seeing is the development of what I would call sort of more risk-based controls. So, the ability to be able to enforce two-factor authentication, but if you're using things like machine learning to learn about that user, and that it's Bob and he uses a MacBook Air and he uses Chrome and he uses AT&T's, internet connection, you can begin to sort of build up a better picture. And I think, certainly we're seeing, the development of that sort of, I think it's pushing it to call it AI, but maybe machine learning type sort of back end.
Which kind of leads me to another question I find curious. Well, Apple has recently done away with the fingerprint authentication, let alone the password itself, and moved to facial scanning. Is that where we're going with user authentication?
I think it's as with all these things, it's going to be a combination. But I think, and if you talk to our CTO Thomas, his vision would be of a passwordless society. So you either have a device who knows who you are, or you have a username, and the application or service that you are accessing knows enough about you, whether even that be down to sort of speed typing, or you can use your facial recognition, that you don't actually need that password. We can just reduce that level of risk using technology to mitigate the need for actually using a password.
Do you think the science fiction images that we're used to. Well, I used to go when I was a kid of retinal scans and DNA. I remember one of the movies, DNA blood authentications. Are these going to take place in the real world?
Fundamentally, it's all going to be about how easy is it for the user. I remember in the old days, I used to do some stuff with IBM, and IBM had this lovely thumbprint scanner that they put on their ThinkPads. And then the story was going around that there was a guy in Germany who was using jelly beans to actually take a thumbprint from somebody on a jelly bean, and it would actually use that to actually create a fake thumbprint. So, I think all the time we're going through these challenges, we come up with some cool tech, then the hackers try and break it, and so on and so forth. So it'll just be a blend of, one, making it blooming easy for the users to use, because otherwise they'll try and avoid it, but two, just making it as secure as possible.
And finally, what you talked about earlier, recommending that enterprise institute a two-factor authentication process. But if you were to talk to people listening, viewing this video right now, what are the main tips that you would give them on a personal level? 2 or 3 tips in managing or in creating their passwords.
Get yourself some form of free password vaulting software. Make sure that you're creating complex passwords. Don't use the dog's name. Don't use your wife's birthday, whatever it might be, because it's, these hackers are clever guys, and any sort of little point of weakness that they can exploit, they will exploit.
So stronger passwords.
Stronger passwords, change them regularly, and do not write them down anywhere.
Especially not in digital form.
In digital form, especially, because, the number of stories about, man-in-the-middle attacks, hackers, and so forth, your PC is not secure, despite how much you might think that your antivirus product or whatever it is protecting you.
And on that optimistic note, thank you very much for being with us, Dan, today. It's been a pleasure.
Great stuff, Lee. Season's greetings to you and the team.
See ya.
Cheers.